Years ago, when I was in my 20s and living in upstate New York, I tried to help out with a youth ministry in a local church that I attended. I gave my testimony a couple times. I helped pick up and drop off some of the youth for youth group. But my willingness to help didn't last long. And here's why. One evening, as I was dropping off some youth, there was one last young lady that I had to take home, and her house was about 5 minutes away. So we had about 5 minutes to talk until I reached her house. And so I asked her, "How are you doing spiritually?" Her response shocked me. She basically said to me, "I don't believe Christianity works." So I asked her what she meant. And she said that she had gone forward to many altar calls. She had given her life to Christ over and over again. And that there was always an initial excitement, but after a few days, or maybe even sometimes a week or two or three, she would struggle with the same old things, and that caused her to conclude that Christianity didn't work. The two big problems that this young lady had was she was taught, number one, an errant view of sin, and number two, an errant view of salvation. I knew then instinctively that something was seriously wrong with what she was being taught. However, I didn't know exactly how to articulate it. And it took me several years before I was able to put my finger on it. And ever since then, it has been a burden of mine to point it out to as many as will listen. The bottom line is, I believe some, if not many, Christians get the sin issue wrong because they downplay sin. They don't get to the root issue. When we as Christians truly get down to the root issue, it will crush us. And it will cause us to get very real about our desperate need of Christ every single moment of our lives. Now, I don't pretend that I have arrived. I am not perfect. I still fail God at times. But I truly believe that all I'm about to say to you is thoroughly biblical and honors God and can and will help you if you are a Christian who truly loves Jesus and wants to pursue holiness. That is my great desire. I hope it is yours as well. We all need to grow in holiness because God says in his word, without holiness, no one will see the Lord. That's Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 14. I believe our sovereign God intends for all of his children to grow in holiness. Romans 8:29 teaches that. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10 teaches that. Philippians chapter 1 and verse 6 teaches that. You know, much of the theology the Bible presents is so interconnected to other areas of theology that if you just get one area wrong, it's going to impact other areas of your theology. Take, for instance, the doctrine of God. If I do not understand that the ultimate reason why God created the universe, if I don't understand what that is, and I get it wrong, it's going to impact my doctrine of man. The Bible teaches that the ultimate reason for God creating the universe, for God creating the world, is his glory. One verse that clearly teaches that is Romans chapter 11 and verse 36, but that's not the only verse. There are many others. But there are other things that the Bible teaches that we can easily replace that with, things that are very important and yet are not ultimate. And we can never make this mistake without real consequences that will impact not just our theology, but our everyday lives as Christians. Take, for instance, the love of God. Does God love the world? Of course. Any Christian knows that. John 3:16 and many other verses teach that. But if we replace the glory of God with the love of God as the ultimate reason for why God created the world, then it will have real consequences in our theology, and it will impact our lives. If I believe that the ultimate reason for God creating the world is God's love, then what does that imply to me at the very least? It implies to me that it says to me that God loves me and he wants me to love him back. Now, is that wrong? No. God does love the world and he does want his children to love him back. But that is not the ultimate reason for God creating the world or even redeeming the world. Again, God does all that he does for his glory. Romans 11:36. If I understand that God creates and does all that he does for his glory, then that tells me that his will and his purpose are supreme, and his will and his purpose will influence all that he does in his world, including what he does in my life and yours. And since his will is supreme, he does not sit back in heaven waiting to see how I will respond or you will respond, but rather he will move in the circumstances of our lives to achieve his purpose and his will. This is often God's reason for using pain in our lives. There are many verses in the New Testament that clearly teach that God uses suffering for our good and for his glory. Just one of many verses is 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 through 9. But if I replace God's glory with his love as his big reason for creation and redemption, and that leads me to believing that God's ultimate desire for me is that I make a choice of my own will without any sovereign influence from him in order to love him back, then it will subconsciously impact how I view God's will, my will, sin, and even salvation in my own personal life. If I believe that God sits back waiting for me to respond to his love, it will impact my theology and my life in some negative ways. Like, number one, it will elevate my will to a level that the Bible does not. Number two, it will make God seem more like a spectator than sovereign to my mind. And number three, it will make salvation and all that it entails seem largely up to me. And I believe that such things were a big part of that young lady's problem and why she said to me, Christianity doesn't work. Before I move on to the doctrine of sin, let me first discuss those three things that I just stated. Does the Bible elevate the will of man above God's will and make God look more like a spectator than sovereign at times, even in salvation? The answer that I get from the Bible is a big no. For instance, Proverbs 16 teaches that God's will is sovereign even over our tongues and what we say. God's will is sovereign over the wicked and their judgment. God's will is even sovereign over the steps that we take in life, the way that we go. God's will, according to Proverbs 16 and verse 33, is even sovereign over the casting of lots, which in our day and age would be something like the roll of the dice. Proverbs 16 is teaching God's will is sovereign over all of those things. Isaiah chapter 45 and verse 7 tells us that God is sovereign over the good and the bad in this world. God can take an arrogant king's sanity away from him, drive him out into the field to make him act like an animal, and then later on give him his sanity back to humble him. In fact, God did this very thing in history to Nebuchadnezzar, and he didn't ask Nebuchadnezzar for permission to do so. God can also raise up a king so that the king stubbornly resists God and is eventually destroyed. He did that to the Pharaoh of Egypt in the book of Exodus, and God did not ask him for his permission to do so. God can take a man who is hunting down and killing Christians, stop him dead in his tracks, blind him for a few days, and then give him his sight back and make him one of the greatest Christian servants in history. He did it to a man named Saul, who was renamed Paul, and God did not ask him for his permission to do so. In Acts chapter 16 and verse 14, God opened the heart of a woman named Lydia so that she would respond to the gospel that Paul preached and be saved. And God didn't ask for her permission to do so. Yes, the Bible does teach that man has a will, and that with his will and his choices, he is accountable to God. But the Bible doesn't teach that man's will can ever in any way thwart God's will. The Bible teaches that God is sovereign over everything in his universe. God does not surrender his sovereignty to anyone or anything. And my dear friends, we cannot water this truth down or deny it without real consequences in our theology and in our everyday lives. The Bible does indeed teach that God is sovereign in salvation. What God did for Lydia in Acts chapter 16, he does every single time anyone is truly converted. In John 6:44, Jesus tells us that no one can come to him unless the Father draws us. In the very next verse, John 6:45, Jesus goes on to say that everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Well, that begs the question of why must it be this way? And the answer that the Bible gives is because of sin within us. Read Jeremiah chapter 17 and verse 9. Read Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32. Read Romans chapter 3, verses 10 through 18. These verses and what they teach are true of the entire human race outside of Christ. Sin within affects our minds, our will, and our emotions to such a degree that we cannot come back to God apart from his grace being at work, drawing us. Romans chapter 9 and verse 16. It is much more biblical and thus preferable to believe God is sovereign in all things, including salvation, than to believe that God kind of sits back waiting to see what we will do before he acts. The former leads to some mystery and not being able to understand how this all fits with the will of man, for sure, absolutely. But it is better to remain biblical and yet have mystery than to do the latter and remove that mystery and put God and his working in this world into some kind of nice little box that we come up with that can easily make us, at worst, heretics, or at best, unbiblical. As to the Christian life, the latter can and will literally lead to psychological and emotional pathologies in the Christian life. I've seen it with my own eyes, and this young lady was a perfect example of that. So what were the problems that this young girl had? She was taught that God is not sovereign in salvation, and ultimately it's up to her whether or not she ended up in heaven. And she was taught that sin, yes, is about what you do, and yes, it is about what you are, which are both true. But she was also taught that you can have a real experience with God in which sin is removed from your heart. Now, I'm sure that she did not have the ability to explain all that, but still, she was regularly taught that man's will can thwart God's will in salvation, and that the highest form of Christianity is only found in those who no longer sin. That led her to believe that she had to will herself to victory in the Christian life. That led her to believe that if there was sin in her life in any way, then she was a second-class Christian at best, or worse, no longer a Christian at all. And after numerous attempts at this, she just gave up. And she said, Christianity doesn't work. And her story illustrates how some Christians completely get sin wrong. So here are three very important, relevant truths that I believe every Christian must know in order to deal biblically with sin in our lives. Important truth about sin, number one. Sin is about what you do, yes, but it is also about who you are within. Romans 5:19a says, for through one man's disobedience, the many were made sinners. It's talking about Adam. Through his one act of disobedience, we were all made sinners. It's not just about committing acts of sin, but what we are essentially within. Jeremiah 17:9 says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? In Matthew 15:19 through 20, Jesus says, for out of the heart, catch that, out of the heart come evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, slanders. These are the things that defile the man. What we do can be sinful, yes, absolutely. But unless you get to the root of the problem, you're just spinning your wheels and going nowhere. In other words, why do we do such sinful things? And the answer that the Bible gives is because there is sin within us. There is sin in our hearts. We are literally sinners. We became sinners because of Adam's original sin. We inherited this from Adam. It is very much a part of who we are from our conception onward in our mother's womb. Psalm 51 and verse 5. This sin within us is going to be with us until we die or Jesus comes again. 1 John 1:8 says that if we deny that we have sin within us, we are deceiving ourselves and the truth is not in us. This sin within us is going to be a part of us until we die or Jesus comes again. So going forward to an altar call is not going to fix this. Taking extreme measures to maybe abuse our bodies and force them to behave is not going to fix this. Even having some great experience with God, which is wonderful. I've had great experiences with God. But those experiences with God did not make me a sinner, did not make me no longer a sinner. The only way to get any measure of greater victory over this starts with being completely honest about what the Bible tells us about ourselves. We are sinners. Sin is in our hearts, and it's going to be there until the day we die. And when we get completely honest about that, then we all have a choice of how we're going to respond to that reality. Number one, we can deny it. We can deny that sin is a reality, in which case we will live it out more and more, and much of the world does this. Or number two, we can seek out an experience through which we believe sin will no longer be a problem for us. Many religions of the world do this. Or number three, we can embrace extreme measures to try and deal with sin within us. This is what Martin Luther did before he became absolutely hopeless and realized how futile it was and realized that justification is by faith alone, which sparked the Protestant Reformation. Or number four, we can be 100% honest about it and allow that to cause us to a life of daily dependence upon God and His grace for greater victory in our fight for holiness. Important truth about sin number two. The root of sin within is self-worship. And I believe it is essentially right here that many, some if not many, Christians, professing Christians, get sin wrong. The root of sin within us is self-worship. You know, when you do weeding in your garden, if you were to just like kind of cut off the tops of the weeds and you don't pull them out by the root, guess what's going to happen? They're going to grow back very quickly, and you're going to be doing that weeding over and over and over and over again. When it comes to spiritual growth in Christ, if we don't get down to the level of the root of sin, we will be forevermore cutting weeds and nothing else. Another way to illustrate this would be the whack-a-mole game. You take a whack at one sin, but as you're whacking that one down, another one pops up. And you do this over and over and over and over again. And this is the entire Christian life of many people. The better approach is to search the Bible to see if there is something at the level of the root of every single sin that we commit. And the answer that the Bible gives to that question is what I just said. It is self-worship. The root of all sin is pride, selfishness, self-worship. Think about it. Why do people lie? self-preservation. Why do people continue to lie even when they're caught in their lies? Well, they do it because they worship themselves. And they think that even when they're caught in their lies, they have a right to demand that their lies be thought of as true. And if others refuse to believe their lies, it's because they don't realize how special they really are. Self-worship. Why do people commit sexual sin? Because they have the attitude of, I deserve pleasure, even if it's sinful pleasure. It's all about self-worship. Why steal something that doesn't belong to you? Well, because people believe that their needs or their desires trump the needs or desires of others. Self-worship. Why do people kill? Because they believe they have the right to determine who lives or dies based upon what they do or say in relation to them. That is complete self-worship. Take every single sin and ask why we do it. And the answer at the level of the root is always the same. It is selfishness, it is pride, it is self-worship. And you see, knowing this truth about sin helps us know one of the big signs that a Christian is actually growing in Christ. You know what it is? An increase in humility, which is the complete opposite of self-worship. You show me a Christian who has truly grown in Christ for decades, and I will show you a Christian who is more humble than many others around them. Think about the first three sins in God's universe. Satan, or Lucifer, wanted to be God. Isaiah 14, 12 through 14. That's self-worship. Adam and Eve wanted to be like God. Genesis 3, 1 through 6. Their attitude, basically after being tempted by the serpent, was, God is now being honest with us. We deserve to be like God, knowing good and evil. What is that? It's self-worship. What about the third sin? Cain killed his brother Abel. Genesis 4, 3 through 8. God accepted Abel's sacrifice, but he didn't accept Cain's. And so Cain's attitude, even after God warned him, was basically, how dare you do that, God? How dare you accept my brother's sacrifice and not mine? I deserve acceptance from you just as much as my brother. I'm offended. I'm going to kill my own brother. Self-worship. Inspect every single sin recorded in the Bible, and you will find the same root every single time. It is self-worship. And that leads to important truth about sin number 3. Genuine worship of God is our only hope in our battle for holiness as Christians. This is the very reason why, after 11 chapters of glorious theology in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through chapter 11, verse 36, after all of that, the very next thing that Paul writes in the book of Romans as he begins to make application is this in Romans 12, 1 through 2. Therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. When you got into an argument with your spouse recently, and something within you pushed you to keep making your point and have the last word, what was that? It was self-worship. How could you correct that in the moment? Well, you could stop and pray and start worshiping God instead. Or maybe you were on the job and you had a job review, an annual review of how you're doing, and your supervisor offered you constructive criticism on how you can improve your job performance. And inside you maybe felt offended and you wanted to defend yourself. But when you were honestly objective about it, you realized there was actually some truth to what he or she said. So why did you get offended? Self-worship. How can you get victory in that moment? Stop, pray, worship God instead. We can literally do this with a lot of our lives because self-worship is a big part of how we live in many ways, some of which we never even realize. But victory in such moments requires that we truly, every day, go back to God in prayer and do Romans 12, 1 through 2. Our heart attitude in prayer ought to be, Jesus, you died for me. Jesus, you saved me. Jesus, you did for me what I could never do for myself. And out of love for you and gratitude and thankfulness, I'm going to give myself back to you today. I offer myself back to you as my ultimate act of worship today. And I know, God, that throughout this day, the world and the flesh and the devil are going to throw many darts at me, and I cannot overcome them in my own strength. But I can in dependence upon you as I decide to worship you in those moments and not myself. Christians who refuse to do this merely play whack-a-mole in their supposed Christian lives. And though we can do that and put on a good show for others, still deep down inside, the reality of our hearts is we are still in love with ourselves. And the truth be told, if that's the real state of our hearts, what you do in the night is going to come out in the light. Our only hope is a daily dependence on God and His grace. And as we give ourselves back to Him and worship Him in truth, rather than worship ourselves, we can have little by little, bit by bit victory in this area. Our only hope is a daily dependence upon God and His grace as we give ourselves back to Him and worship Him and not ourselves. Is it any wonder that Jesus said in Luke chapter 9 and verse 23, if anyone will come after me, he must deny himself daily and follow me. Jesus, as God in human flesh, knows what is in our hearts, John 2:25. And merely saying, I believe, doesn't cut it. It is in following Jesus and denying that bent to worship ourselves that our faith is truly lived out. James chapter 2, verses 14 through 26. If we do not truly know God's saving grace within, we can't do this. Please do not hear me saying that I believe we can gut this out and worship God in truth all on our own. I can't, you can't, none of us can. But if we're truly born again and we have God within us to help us, He will, if we will depend on Him. But if we prefer to excuse our sin and use God's grace as a license for it, then we need to know that the truth is we have no real victory in this fight, because the sad reality of our hearts that we are denying is we are truly in love with ourselves and not Jesus. Do we really want to get over ourselves and worship God in truth? Then I believe this is what the Bible would have us to do. This is my everyday struggle. Some days are better than others. Don't hear me saying that I have arrived. I am no better than anyone else. But because I believe this is the root issue when it comes to the reality of sin in our hearts, my prayer is that anyone watching this will realize it as well and start to live in light of it in full dependence on God and His grace. This alone is what has made a difference in my fight for holiness. And since all of it is right out of the Bible, I believe it can help anyone else as well who will hear it, learn it, heed it, and apply it.